perhaps I have to shorten. Okay. Dear Anne, thank you for taking the time for this interview. Time is peace. So we start. You served in the US Army for 29 years and retired as a colonel. You also spent 16 years in the US Diplomatic Corps, serving in US embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia. In March 2003, you resigned from the US government in protest against the US war against Iraq. Since then, you've been committed to peace. This year is NATO's 75th birthday, and it's being celebrated in Washington with high-ranking government and military officials. How do you feel about NATO celebrating its 75th anniversary?
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you mentioned in your introduction, I served both in the U.S. military, 29 years, retired as a colonel. I also was one of my assignments was with a NATO subcommand called Allied Forces Central Europe, which is in the Netherlands. So I've had exposure to NATO firsthand. And then as a U.S. diplomat, I served in countries where there were NATO actions. And after resignation 21 years ago, I am very, very negative about NATO and its 75th anniversary, because NATO, rather than being a force for peace, seems now to be a force for war. And of course, NATO will say, well, sometimes you have to have a war in order to get the peace. You have to go ahead and kill lots of people in order to stop the killing. And that rationale I find very troublesome and repugnant. And therefore, I think NATO, the 75th anniversary, we have to go back and look at what NATO has done during those 75 years and analyze really where peace was made from this, a peace that should have been made really from diplomacy and not from military action, which is the way NATO goes about doing things.
Yes, thank you. Now, this counter event was planned by a large alliance, including many veterans, military personnel, and historians, and so on, with relevant military and geostrategic experience. What is your explanation for the fact that these people, including you, are currently so vehemently committed to diplomacy, ceasefires, and negotiations, while people with less experience are pushing forward armament and thus escalation and threat scenarios worldwide?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, and really, it's the answer is in the question, because it's the veterans, the people that have actually been in wars, that say we don't want to do it anymore, and no one else should, because the consequences that we have seen from it firsthand are so negative, so horrible, that there's got to be a better way to resolve international crises. That shooting people is not the way to resolve crises. And ultimately, every time that the military has been used, ultimately it's negotiations and words, diplomacy, that have ultimately resolved the issue. So why don't we just go straight from the crisis to resolving the issue with non-lethal means and leave the military out of it?
Yes.
That's why we had so many people in our counter summit that were from the militaries.
Okay, yes. The Peace Summit with the core events from May 5th to 7th July began well beforehand with a march from Maine to Washington. And there are other various events after that. Can you give us something and tell us about your impressions? And were there any personal highlights, perhaps?
Yes, we were so pleased that Veterans for Peace decided that the organization would sponsor a walk that went all the way from the northern tip of the United States all the way down the eastern coast to Washington, D.C. It was a trip that took 60 days, and during those 60 days, the marchers stopped every night in a different city, and local organizers hosted events in the city about a variety of things. About certainly NATO was one of the subjects, but it was the increased militarization of our U.S. society, and then putting in the broader context of the whole world. So the group stopped at cities that have big military involvement, and sometimes it's actually active duty military, or it may be the merchants of war, the corporations that build the weapons that are used to kill people around the world. So all the way from Maine down through Connecticut, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, then into New York, down through New Jersey, Maryland, and then finally, in Delaware. That's the home of President Biden. They stopped in Delaware, and then on into Washington, D.C. So it was a very robust schedule. There were approximately 500 people that took part in the various stops along the way. They didn't march like 12 hours a day. It was a symbolic march, and usually 3 to 5, and sometimes up to like 8 miles per day. But it, as the weather got colder, or started in cold weather and then got hotter and hotter, because many of the marchers were older, it was the symbolism of marching and then having the events in the local communities that was the most important.
Wow, very nice, beautiful. Unfortunately, this hasn't been reported in our media so far, although the media is full of reports about the NATO summit. The thousands of people of peace are still being categorically ignored. In Germany, media reporting changed significantly and was restricted almost suddenly on February 24, 2022. It largely said goodbye to serious, factual, critical, illuminating all aspects and fact-based reports in favor of emotional and one-sided partisan reporting. Many central aspects are also excluded that do not fit the simplified black and white narrative. What do you think is the cause of this one-sidedness, and how do you assess the media coverage of the leading media in the USA, and especially on your summit now, and on the Ukraine and Israel wars in general?
Well, the media in the United States and internationally really are, totally one-sided toward the propaganda that the governments put out. Here in the United States, it was impossible for us to get any national media coverage for our very important counter summit. We did have some independent journalists who came and ultimately will be reporting on it, but none of the major TV stations, websites reported at all on it. We were not shocked because the U.S. media does not cover that. It is a media that tragically is bought by the U.S. government, and it reports on what the U.S. government feels is important, not what the public should be knowing about. So we do rely a lot on international coverage, for various event or various issues, like Al Jazeera covering, the war, the Israeli genocide of Gaza. We do have some independent groups like Mondoweiss and Palestine Eye and things like that, but they are very, very small in the media coverage scene. So on one level, sometimes we may get more international coverage. We had more international reporters that actually came to our rally at the White House on Sunday than we did. We had absolutely zero U.S. media coverage at the rally at the White House from the United States, but we did have two TV stations from Slovakia and one from Finland. So that was the only media coverage that we got on that day.
So it's just like the same how in Germany that goes. Oh no. Okay, last year we met at the Vienna Peace Summit and I talked to you about the peace negotiation process. You referred to the UN's already existing guidelines for ceasefire agreements with emphasis on two different phases of negotiations. The first and anything but trivial for a stable ceasefire as a basis for the second for a lasting peace. Since the first phase is consistently excluded, you explicitly pointed it out again in an article and explained the steps in detail. So now, there are current events that suggest that the first phase of negotiations for a ceasefire may have begun. For example, Putin's offer to negotiate a ceasefire, and just a day before yesterday, Russia's peace plan with the proposal to jointly administer Crimea, Orban's trip to Kiev and Moscow with the main concern of a ceasefire, Glavchev's offer to propose Bulgaria as a mediator for peace talks just now at the NATO summit, or Zelensky's rhetorical departure from the maximum demands, the restoration of the 1991 borders. How do you classify these processes? Are they a sign that we are moving into the first phase, or are they just another flash in the pan?
Well, we certainly hope they are an indicator that we'll be moving forward on this, but as stuck as the U.S. is on apparently seeing Ukraine fight to the last person, I am not. I'm not really too positive that this very important initiative by the Russian Federation is going to go anywhere. This Jeffrey Sachs has written an excellent article that talks about the numbers of times that the Russian Federation has made proposals for peace talks, for negotiations, and they have been rebuffed by the United States and therefore then rebuffed by Ukraine each time. So even though this is a very detailed proposal, and it could happen very easily with all of the main actors here in Washington, I am not positive at all that the United States will take up this proposal. President Zelensky is here in Washington, and there will be side meetings of the United States with him. But I'm not positive at all that the United States will move forward with this, tragically, because that means more and more people are going to get killed in Ukraine and in Russia. And it's a terrible indicator of how warlike the United States continues to be.
Yeah. Oh, that's so sad. I had hope you had better news. Okay, understand. So next, the message that came out of the NATO summit in Vilnius was NATO first, Ukraine later. Ukraine should only become a member when it can no longer become an alliance case for NATO. So never. Zelensky was visibly upset and called it unprecedented and absurd. The accession would weaken NATO, so there was a conflict of objectives, and NATO decided to strengthen itself. Article 1 of the final declaration states, this summit marks a milestone in strengthening our alliance. So that's what it's all about. So today, the crucial question is it still about Ukraine or just about NATO? What interests does NATO or the US, which dominates it, primarily pursue? And is there a new geostrategic alignment?
Well, President Zelensky was upset a year ago, and he's still upset now. The numbers of NATO countries that continue to do arms transfers to Ukraine, of course, is still large. But he can see, and the world can see, that NATO is shifting, really shifting from Europe onto Asia and the Pacific. I live in Hawaii, and right now the rim of the Pacific naval exercises, the largest naval war practice in the world, is going on. And there are 29 countries participating. 8 of them are from NATO. So NATO is moving into the Pacific, and their partnerships that they have had with Colombia, and now they have them with South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. It shows that NATO is not just a European and North American organization. It definitely is now what we call global NATO. And that is a very worrisome development for all of us, that this military alliance is now thinking that it is an alliance for any crisis anywhere in the world.
Okay, that's the topic for my next question. So you answered it, but I read it. Hardly noticed in Europe, whose attention is absorbed by the wars in Ukraine and in Israel, the situation in East Asia is more tense than ever before. A slow geopolitical revolution is taking place. NATO, which was once focused on the Atlantic, as you just said, is turning to the Pacific. The North Korean news agency KNCA wrote, NATO's chariot is racing towards the Asia Pacific. And Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said, we have seen what NATO has done in Europe. It must not now attempt to sow chaos here in the Asia Pacific region or anywhere else in the world. China's defense ministry has accused NATO of being a warmonger. Wu Chan said, it's fair to say NATO is like a walking war machine. Wherever it goes, there be instability. As NATO celebrates its 75th anniversary, what do you think of the move to expand NATO's sphere of influence into the Indo-Pacific? How should the world's ongoing multipolarity be organized?
Well, as I mentioned, we certainly are seeing very well that NATO is becoming a global military alliance. I will add to what I mentioned previously that we should have great concern about NATO, what NATO countries are doing on the Israeli genocide of Gaza. The weapons transfers of many NATO countries to Israel. It's not just the United States that is providing weapons to Israel, although we are providing a great number of them. But Germany is providing weapons. And in fact, the German government has been sued by the Nicaraguan government for its complicity in the genocide that the Israelis are conducting in Gaza. But it is very, very troubling that the NATO countries, whether it's under the name of the alliance or because they're all allied anyway, and particularly when the US gives an order, we need to support Ukraine, we need to support Israel, that all of a sudden all of these countries do the bidding of the United States and send in these weapons to further the conflict. I was called in November to be an expert witness at the UN Security Council on the issue of weapons transfers. And that is the sum of what I spoke about, was that is, as long as countries headed by the United States keep transferring weapons into these conflicts, then the conflicts will continue. The only one way to reduce and ultimately end the conflicts is to stop transferring these weapons. And while the UN Security Council wanted information about transfers into Ukraine, I took the liberty of talking about the weapons transfers that the United States and other countries were making into Israel, which was prolonging and still prolongs 9 months later the Israeli genocide of Gaza.
Yeah. Okay. Another issue. The NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 had the primary aim of creating a relationship of mutual trust in a common security and stability area by means of confidence-building measures and disarmament. For example, no militarily substantial NATO combat troops should be stationed in the new alliance states, and others should not be stationed permanently, and nuclear weapons should be avoided. Today, thousands of alone Bundeswehr soldiers are permanently stationed in Lithuania, and the President Andrzej Duda recently declared that Poland was ready to deploy NATO nuclear weapons. I have two questions about it. First, under these circumstances, do you see any opportunity to break out of the escalation spiral and return to the original, comprehensively defined concept of security? And if so, what would be necessary and what real political steps would have to be taken?
Well, it's horrible what's happening in terms of the expansion of U.S. and NATO forces in Poland, in Romania. The largest U.S. military base in Europe now is not in Germany, where it was for decades, but now in Poland. So the expansion of U.S. militarism in Europe is proceeding at a rapid pace, and the number of military war practices, ground practice, are increasing. The largest defender exercises every other year are being held in Europe. The numbers of U.S. military and NATO military that are practicing right on the border of the Russian Federation is definitely worrisome to President Putin, as it should be worrisome to all of us, because if NATO is doing its war practice right on that border, then the only logical thing that the Russian Federation can do is to protect itself from potentially an invasion, even though NATO and US would say, oh, we're not talking at all about an invasion, we're just practicing. But what are you practicing for? And so but then when the Russian Federation takes steps to protect itself, then it's, oh, the Russians are getting ready to invade everybody else. And that's used by the Baltic states to say, we are the first ones that will be invaded, and therefore we have to increase our military and allow NATO to have all sorts of war games in our countries. So it's the whole concept from 40 years ago has been thrown out the window. It's now, it's not a cold war anymore, it's a hot war that's going, it's a hot situation that could very easily, with miscalculation, mistake, turn into a full-fledged military war.
Yeah. Whew. Terrible and absurd because of the NATO fifth article 5. So yeah. The second question, this large-scale rearmament, the militarization of society, and also the required change in mentality, including the recruitment of young people, is based on a constantly repeated claim that Putin had, quote, clearly said that after the Ukraine, they would attack other European countries till the Atlantic. Would demanding ultimate proof of this claim be a first step toward de-escalation? I would say we are currently trying this in the Bundestag, but have less hope. Or how do you think we can penetrate with facts? And I'd like to add, there are other unproven allegations or even secrecy, such as the Nord Stream attack. This was an attack on our national security, but our government is turning the tables and saying that information about it affects our national security. Meanwhile, the NATO members, Denmark and Sweden, have stopped the investigation. I think that can actually only mean that friendship is relative in foreign policy relations or even in the NATO, isn't it?
Well, there's certainly a lot of propaganda that each of the countries is putting out, and this whole thing that the Russian Federation is ready to invade Europe all the way to the Atlantic Ocean is nonsense. I mean, that's just pure propaganda. It's so dangerous for international relations, what some of the governments are putting out, including the United States. I mean, the fact that that these terrible incidents that have happened, like the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, have not been firmly investigated and publicly reported on the results of the investigation, and the written and oral suspicions that governments have that it was, that it wasn't, well, I guess the word is that it was Russia that blew up their own pipelines.
Yeah. Absurd.
How ridiculous is that? And who benefited from the blowing up of it? It certainly wasn't Russia, who was making money out of it. Whoever blew it up wanted to make sure that the Russian Federation did not make any money out of this, and that they're one of their primary means of financial transactions, the selling of gas and oil to European countries, that becomes foremost one of the sanctions on Russia, and to allow that pipeline to continue in the view of, for certainly the United States, was breaking the sanctions. Now, for other countries that were benefiting from having cheaper natural gas and oil coming in, you would question, why would they want to blow up their source of cheaper fuel? So the indications are not that Russia blew it up. I mean, for us as amateur detectives, it doesn't make a bit of sense. And yet now we have, as you mentioned, that the investigations have been ended, although I would say they know exactly what happened. They're just not making public who actually did it.
I think also so. Okay, another issue. You've been working for peace for over 20 years now. Can you tell us something about your everyday peace work? Do you feel a change since the Ukraine escalation and perhaps also after the Middle East escalation? And which voices are reaching you? What are their core concerns, especially now in connection with the Peace Summit in Washington? What is your resume until now? And how do you look to the future?
Well, yes, I've now been a part of the peace movement since my resignation in 2003. So that's 21 years. And I resigned over the Iraq War. There was a huge mobilization against the Iraq War, and to an extent to the continued war in Afghanistan. And then there's been kind of a lull, but the decision of the Russian Federation to invade parts of Ukraine, saying that Ukraine had crossed the red line that they had in the negotiations on accession into NATO and the treatment of Russian speakers in the Donbass region. I mean, all of those are certainly areas of concern, but it does not justify, in my opinion, at all, the Russian decision to conduct the war on Ukrainian soil. And for us to, in the U.S., there's certainly a huge number of U.S. citizens that say, of course, Ukraine has to defend itself. The U.S. must come to the aid of Ukraine, and trying to counter that narrative in terms of, I mean, I agree, the people do have the right to defend themselves from any invasion, but trying to move toward resolving the issues of accession to NATO, better treatment of the people in the Donbass, things like that. Doing it by non-military means is the way to do it, which actually the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements were all about, that were torpedoed in great measure by the US and the UK. So that the mobilization on the Ukraine war has had a certain effect, although it's been a divisive one, I would say, in the peace movement in the United States, because a lot of people in the peace movement say, yes, Ukraine must defend itself, and yes, there should be negotiations. Others saying, let's just get the negotiations going right now. And then on the issue of the Israeli genocide of Gaza, that has probably brought forth more people working on trying to get a ceasefire and a settlement of issues. And despite the huge numbers of people worldwide that have come out to say there must be a ceasefire, there must be negotiations, the US government continues to support the Zionist Israeli war government in its genocide of the people of Gaza. And we have been in Congress, in the US Congress, every day since November. We have had hundreds of people in the US Congress. Every day we have anywhere from 10 to 20 to 50 people that are going to 15, 20, 30 offices in both the House of Representatives and the Senate to plead with the Congress people to sign a ceasefire and do not vote for any more weapons to Israel. And yet we only have 80 members of Congress that have called for a ceasefire out of 535. So the Congress is dug in on support for Israel because most of the Congress people get payments from Zionist-related organizations like AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and they know that they will suffer during the elections because millions of dollars will be put into the campaigns to have them thrown out of Congress. So it's so difficult when you see it in your very eyes a genocide occurring and you can't get your own government, our US government, to stop funding Israel and to threaten the state of Israel to say, if you don't stop this, we will put a blockade on you, we will put sanctions on you, we will do everything we can do to make you stop killing Palestinians, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, and stop the settlements that continue to grow on Palestinian lands. So while we do have big mobilizations, well, finally, Joe Biden has said, yes, there must be a ceasefire, and yes, there must be negotiations on this. But it took him 7 months before he said that word ceasefire. And in that period of time, over 20,000 Palestinians had been killed that we know of, plus tens of thousands that are still under the rubble that no one can get to.
Oh, it's so cruel. And as you said, it's all about money, not about lives.
No, it's about the money.
So cool. Okay, then something perhaps positive. My last question. You with all of us say, no to NATO, yes to peace. If you could dream for a moment, what would a world without NATO look like?
Well, a world without NATO would look like each of the countries that are in NATO would have better health systems, better education systems, better benefits for their citizens, because money that is now being spent on military weapons would now be spent on making life better for their citizens. So I think it would be a very positive world if we were able to use the money that goes into NATO and use it for really life-affirming things for people. It would make the world a much safer and more livable place. And it would make Mother Earth feel much better, because I think Mother Earth is now telling us again and again and again that all of these wars and all of the environmental effects of wars are something she is not going to put up with, and she will take actions against us in climate changes that will make this planet unbearable for us humans and get rid of us if we're not able to take care of her, Mother Earth.
Yeah, that's right. Beautiful. Thank you very much for the interview and taking the time.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.